men would go out into the street, they would ask passers-by. I mean, in New York, the likelihood that the answer would be yes is higher than in Colombia, are you Jewish? And women would be stopped and asked, are you Jewish? And in the case of men, they would be invited to put on tefillin, and women to light Shabbat candles. So you had people putting on tefillin in the streets of New York. It is not surprising that many Jews of a more secular disposition did not like this whole campaign. First of all, the idea of stopping people in the street and saying, are you Jewish, bothered them. And then the public display of such a specific ritual also made them uncomfortable. What's less widely known is that the Rebbe was also critiqued in certain segments of the Orthodox world. And why was that? There were those who felt that it was ridiculous. Why do you try and get otherwise non-observant Jews to put on tefillin? So what's going to happen? A man will put on tefillin, they'll be taken off, and then he'll go eat a treif meal, have bacon and eggs. A woman will light Shabbat candles, and then she and the family will go out to watch a movie. They'll go to a theater. So they argued that it was ridiculous. It had no value. And the Rebbe's insight was, no, it had value, even if they then go and eat an unkosher meal, even if they don't then observe the Sabbath. Each mitzvah had a value in and of itself. Now, of course, that attitude did lead many people to an appreciation of mitzvot that then caused them to observe more mitzvot. But the journey, each step, had value in and of itself. You couldn't only say it had value if it leads to that. And that was one of the Rebbe's striking insights. There was a period of many years, I don't know how many of you might have ever seen it, but every Friday in the New York Times, in the middle of the front page, there would be a small classified ad, Jewish women and girls, candle lighting tonight is at 5:18 p.m. Now, first of all, the fact that it said Jewish women and girls was in itself innovative, because the Rebbe wanted all girls, starting at the age of 3, to light Shabbat candles. Actually, I should clarify that. He didn't actually want them to light the candles at the age of 3. He's not a pyromaniac. But that they should all be encouraged with their mothers. In traditional Jewish life, girls would not light candles. Some would do it at bat mitzvah. Many would not do it as long as they were in their parents' house. They would do it when they got married. And he put it on the page of the Times. Now, a lot of traditional Jews would just know to automatically look to check on candle lighting time. But a lot of Jews just were struck by the fact of this outreach of the Rebbe to them. On January 1st, 2000, the Times published the Millennial Edition. So it was the regular New York Times for that day. But they also published a mock edition of the New York Times for January 1st, 2100. It was actually a somewhat discomforting front page because so many of the articles, it was hard to understand what they were talking about. Or, if you could understand it, it was troubling. Should robots be allowed to vote in elections? And then in the middle of the page, Jewish women and girls, candle lighting tonight. It turned out that an editor at the Times, and from what I understand, he was an Irish Catholic, he was the editor for that special page, had checked the calendar and saw that January 1st, 2100 was a Friday. And he had called up Chabad, and he said, on January 1st, 2100, what time will candle lighting be? And they were able to do so because there's a fixed Jewish calendar. And he went along and did it. That story, I think, in many ways epitomizes a very unusual feature of Chabad, established under the influence of the Rebbe. As a general rule, any of the denominational groups in Judaism will get their primary support from the members of the group. So if you analyzed all the people who contribute to a fundraising campaign for Hebrew Union College, they're obviously going to be disproportionately comprised of members of Reform congregations. The same applies in all of the denominations. The unusual feature of Chabad is that it often elicits support from people who are not traditionally observant Jews in that regard. It cuts across denominational lines. One of the reasons, I believe, is explained in that story. There are many Jews who have strong emotional feelings about Judaism, very much want to see the Jewish people perpetuated, they want to see Judaism perpetuated, but are not necessarily that confident that their great-grandsons and great-granddaughters will be leading such actively Jewish lives. They are confident that on January 1st, 2100, there will be Chabad people urging people to light Shabbat candles. What I want to do, though, now is ultimately, and this is what I wanted to achieve in the book, the Rebbe is an historical figure of significance. He has a tremendous impact in the Jewish community and in the general world. But ultimately, whether or not the Rebbe will be significant to you depends on, does he have teachings that could reverberate in your own lives? And one of the things I tried to do in the book was identify 7 virtues, I call it, of the Rebbe, that I think help account for the unusual phenomenon of Chabad's expansion even in the aftermath of the Rebbe's death. As a general rule, when a movement has a charismatic leader and the leader dies, the movement usually goes into decline. The Rebbe suffered a stroke in '92. He died 2.5 years later in '94. And during that period, there was no shortage of predictions that Chabad was going to contract significantly. But it didn't. And the 7 traits I identified constitute, in my view, a sort of Torah Sheba'al Peh, sort of oral law that shluchim could look to. These represent, the Rebbe left behind a very large legacy of teachings, but these traits, I think, also represented guidelines for how to behave. So what are some of them? One of them was a real sense of unconditional love. So you'll say, what's the chiddush? What's the new insight? The mitzvah in the Torah of love your neighbor as yourself always had a special status in Jewish life. Hillel held that it was the summary statement of all of Judaism. What's hateful unto you, don't do unto your neighbor. Zeh kol haTorah kula. This is the whole Torah. More than 100 years later, Akiva and Hillel are really 2 of the preeminent Talmudic figures. Akiva says, "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, zeh klal gadol b'Torah." Love your neighbor as yourself. This is the major principle. This is a or the major principle of the Torah. The problem was it wasn't really properly observed. The Talmud itself says, and somebody asked me about this statement today in the Talmud itself teaches that sinas chinam, causeless hatred, caused the destruction of the temple. It led to a terrible civil war within the Jewish community. It led literally to the murder of Jews by other Jews. And this has been a perennial problem. I'll give you an example from medieval Jewish history. One of the tragic events in medieval Jewish life, and there were many unhappy events, in 1240, the Talmud is burned in Paris. Now, obviously, the burning of the Talmud at any time would be regarded as a terrible event, but it was much more terrible in the early medieval period when there was no printing press. 24 wagons of volumes of the Talmud were burned. Every single one of them had been handwritten. So we know the efforts that were involved. How did this terrible event come about? Because the burning of the Talmud was ordered by the Dominican order, which led the Inquisition there. At first, the Inquisition in France had only been set up to root out Catholic heresy. But then 3 rabbis from the French Jewish community, well, obviously from the Jewish community, 3 rabbis brought to them what they regarded as heretical writings by a Jewish writer and asked that these should also be burned. The heretical rabbi's name was Moses Maimonides, and they regarded some of the writings in the Guide to the Perplexed and in the opening volume of his Mishnah Torah as heretical. Once you opened that up to the Dominicans, they started looking into the Talmud, and that's how it came about. When the Talmud was burned, one of those rabbis was so overcome with remorse, he wanted to go and pray at Maimonides' grave and beg forgiveness. He wasn't able to. It wasn't so easy to travel in those days. But he wrote a book called Sharei Tshuva, The Gates of Repentance, which is still studied in yeshivas as a model of repentance. But his life gives testimony. His name was Yonah Gerundi. And his life gives testimony to what can happen when you have causeless hatred, when you have such a lack of appreciation. So what do I mean when I say that the Rebbe believed in a non-judgmental sort of love? Israel Meir Lau, who later on became one of the truly renowned chief rabbis of England, when he was a young rabbi, came to visit. When he was a young rabbi, can I be heard?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Okay. When he was a young rabbi, and the meaning of life. When Israel Meir Lau was a young rabbi, he came to visit the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said, "What sort of work are you involved in?" And he said, "I'm involved in Kiruv Rechokim," the Hebrew term that means I'm involved in bringing those who are far away near. And the Rebbe said to him, "How do we know who's Karov? How do we know who's Rachok? How do we know who's near? How do we know who's far? They're all precious in God's eyes." Right away, he wanted to take away from the traditionally religious Jews a sense they're superior to other people. Everybody has their own strengths and weaknesses. Don't think in those terms. Think, do I have something to offer people? But don't think that I'm going to be the one who's going to make them better and they'll be like me. You know, he wanted to root that out. I'm friendly with a man who I saw literally last night, one of the preeminent philanthropists in the world of Chabad, George Rohr. In fact, George, I know, has played a key role even here in establishing the Chabad at the university. And George, in addition to being a very generous philanthropist, is himself a knowledgeable Jew. And he attends Kilas Yeshurun, a modern Orthodox synagogue on the Upper East Side. And some years ago, he started a beginner's minyan for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. There are many Jews who find it hard to attend a traditional service on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur or at any time because the service is in Hebrew and they don't really know Hebrew. So there are a lot of prayers that are hard for them to follow. So a beginner service, they do fewer prayers, but each prayer is explained carefully. And the idea is that over a period of time, one learns the whole siddur. So George was very proud, and between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, he met the Rebbe, and he said, "I want the Rebbe to know that I conducted a Rosh Hashanah service for 180 Jews who had no background." The Rebbe somehow didn't seem pleased by the comment, so the Rebbe at that point was really already quite old, so Rohr assumed that the Rebbe hadn't heard him properly, so he said the same thing over in a louder voice. "I want the Rebbe to know I conducted a Rosh Hashanah service for 180 Jews who had no background." The Rebbe says, "What do you mean they had no background? They're the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah." Right away, he was searching for commonalities. So that was part of the Rebbe's message of love. But there was another part too, and this is a very remarkable feature of the Rebbe. Love always remained focused on individuals. There are no shortage of charismatic leaders who speak of love in broad terms, but you really want to know how's it like in their very individual relationships. I'll tell you now a story which probably was a key element in how I came to write this book. In 1986, I was living in Israel, and I received a phone call from my mother that my father, Shlomo Telushkin, had suffered a stroke and was in a coma. And I, of course, went back to the States immediately. My father was an accountant, and one of his accounts was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. My father had been the Rebbe's accountant he had been the accountant for over 40 years because he was not only the accountant for the Rebbe, he had been the accountant for the Rebbe's father-in-law, the previous Rebbe. And every day, I get 2 phone calls from the Chabad office. The Rebbe wants to know how your father is. My father comes out of his coma, and he's confused. He unfortunately suffered left side paralysis from that point on. The fortunate thing was he never lost the ability to speak, but he was also a bit confused. Some of the time, sometimes he wasn't. And I continued to get the calls twice a day. A few days later, I get a call from Rabbi Krinsky, the Rebbe's very close aide. He said, "We had a meeting of Merkaz, we had a meeting of the leadership this morning, and an accounting question came up, and the Rebbe said, 'Ask Shlomo.'" So I said to Rabbi Krinsky, "You know how sick my father is? He's in ICU, you know." And he said, "Oh, the Rebbe knows," but the Rebbe still said, "Ask Shlomo." So, of course, I brought the question to my father, and he thought for a moment, and he said, "Oh, the answer's obvious," and he gave it. I realized at that moment what the Rebbe had done. He's sitting there in Brooklyn dealing with all these issues confronting world Jewry, but he's also thinking about my father, who's lying in a hospital bed, feeling vulnerable to an extent we could all imagine. My father had been a very vigorous person, and from that stroke on, he could no longer work. My father used to give a weekly shiur, a weekly class in Talmud. He could no longer do it. His life, in many ways, had ended, and the Rebbe wanted him to know, no, there were still things for him to do. But it goes even beyond that. The Rebbe had a wonderful sense of what I call moral imagination. He didn't want to ask my father a question that was so simple it would seem condescending, On the other hand, he certainly didn't want to ask a question that would be so complex my father would be frustrated. And so he came up with a question that my father could also answer. This is what I meant when I said he had an extraordinary concern with the individual. One of the people I spoke to in the book, Rabbi, who I cite in the book, Shmuel Kaplan, Chabad Shliach for probably almost 40 years or so in Baltimore, told me he was in Kollel, as Rabbi Epstein was. You know, Kollel is a special, it's a yeshiva, but a yeshiva where the students are young married students, and they're given a stipend so that they can devote their time to learning, which Kaplan was. But he was also told at the Rebbe's directive by Rabbi Chodakov that there was a teenage girl there who was in the throes of a tremendous rebellion against Judaism and also a lot of depression and upset, and that he was assigned to try and deal with her questions. And Kaplan said it took up a great deal of time, and the girl would often write letters to the Rebbe, and Kaplan was shocked. The Rebbe always responded within 2 days. On one occasion, she wrote a letter to the Rebbe expressing the tremendous emotional pain she was in, and the Rebbe wrote back and said to her, "I feel your pain." This, however, didn't assuage the girl. It actually got her angry because she felt that the Rebbe was being condescending to her. And she wrote back an angry letter. "What do you mean you feel my pain? How do you know what I'm really feeling?" You know, she felt that it was just words from the Rebbe. This time Kaplan said, and he has a copy of what the Rebbe wrote, the Rebbe responded within 2 hours. And this is what he wrote. "When you will merit to grow up and marry and God willing have a child, the nature of things are that in the first year, towards the end of the first year, a child begins to teeth. And teething is a painful process, and the child cries as a result. And the mother feels that pain as if it were her own. Kach ani margish et tzarech. That is how I feel your pain." Kaplan said that message reached the girl. He said from that point on, it's not like overnight everything became okay, but from that point on, she felt that there was someone who really identified with her, and that started the process. So that's one example I wanted to give, what it means to have an unconditional love and to stay focused on individuals. Jonathan Sacks, the immediate past chief rabbi of England, said that a good leader creates followers. A great leader creates leaders. And that's, in a sense, was also true of not also true, he actually said it about the Rebbe. One of the early people I interviewed for the book was Leibel Groner. Leibel Groner, like Rabbi Krinsky, was a secretary to the Rebbe, and a very close secretary. And Rabbi Groner told me a story that early in his life he had been married, he was married, he had children, and a halachic question arose concerning the Brit. There was a question, he had twins, and the question is, does the Mayel, does the one who performs the circumcision, have to make a separate blessing over each child, or is it one blessing that covers both? The general ruling is over each child. But so he asked the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said to him, "You have smicha, you have ordination like me, you can answer that question." And so he went back and he answered the question, and the Rebbe said, "What did you conclude?" And he told the Rebbe, and the Rebbe smiled and said, "That's what I would have concluded." He went out of his way very often to try and empower people. I came across a wonderful story told about Moshe Yitzchak Hecht, but you have to remember his name because it's critical to the story. Rabbi Moshe Yitzchak Hecht. Hecht becomes the Chabad Shliach in New Haven, and he's having a lot of problems. First of all, it's hard to keep the operation going. He's having problems raising enough money. I'm sure Rabbi Epstein has never had that problem here. Hecht was the only Chabad Shliach I ever heard who had that problem. So he's having problems. He's not raising enough money. And he's also having his own religious issues. He's like like any regular human being. We have a host of problems. He writes a letter to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe's response, I know because it's printed in one of the volumes. There were 30 volumes of letters of the Rebbe. So Hecht writes to the Rebbe, and he says to him at a certain point, "I need you to help, and I need you to do it all." He doesn't get back any sympathy from the Rebbe. The Rebbe writes back, "I have already done as you have suggested. I have sent to New Haven Rabbi Moshe Yitzchak Hecht. It is apparent from your letter that you don't know this man. You don't know the strengths that were given him. You should at least try to get to know him now, and then everything will immediately change." He would send people back to themselves. And Lav Dafka, not only with his own Chabad people. I was pretty much near the conclusion of writing the book, and I heard a story that I knew I had to put in, and I had, fortunately, just enough time to do it. Tzvi Hirsch Weinrib is an Orthodox rabbi, but he was definitely not part of Chabad. And Weinrib was a scholarly fellow. In fact, today he is the editor of the English language translation that's coming out of the Steinsaltz Talmud, and he was the longtime head of the OU. But when this story happened in 1970, he was 30 years old. He had just gotten his doctorate in child psychology in Maryland at the university. He was working in the public school system, and he was going around, and he was also giving Talmud classes at night. And as he put it, he had an early midlife crisis. He was married, he had 2 children, he didn't really know which direction he wanted to pursue in his life. And he was the sort of person who, when he had a problem, would share it with friends. And one friend was a Chabad rabbi and says, why don't you call and try and see the Rebbe? So he calls up the Rebbe's office. Rabbi Chodakov, he's put in touch with Rabbi Chodakov. He's telling Chodakov what some of the issues are. And then he hears a voice coming from the background. And suddenly the voice from the background says, who are you talking to? So Chodakov says, who are you? So Weinrib wasn't yet sure if he was actually going to meet with the Rebbe, and he was a little embarrassed about some of his problems, so he wanted to retain anonymity. So he said, I'm a Jew from Maryland. He lived in Silver Springs. He said, I'm a Jew from Maryland. And he then continues to ask Chodakov questions, and Chodakov is repeating his answers, so it's clear that he's repeating it for the sake of the other person in the room, who he deduced was the Rebbe. And then at a certain point, the Rebbe says, tell him that there's a Jew in Maryland he should go consult with. His name is Weinrib. Weinrib is staggered. So he says to Chodakov, I'm Weinrib. Chodakov is staggered. Repeats it to the Rebbe. The Rebbe said, Azoi, if that's the case, he should consult with himself. Weinrib told me that story transformed his life. He said, I was the sort of person who, whenever a problem would arise in my life, would immediately start calling this person and that person, consulting with other people. And he said, ever since that happened, I realized that the first person I need to consult with is myself. Very often, it's true, when people come to you with an issue, they themselves don't really know what they want, not because they can't deduce it, but they haven't really made the effort to deduce it. And he said, ever since that happened, when I have an issue coming up in my life, I go to a comfortable chair, I sit down, I read a little of the Rebbe's writings to put myself in the mood, and then I really ask myself, what do I want to do in this situation? So the Rebbe wanted to empower people. Jonathan Sachs was 21 years old, and he's in the Rebbe's office, and he says to the Rebbe, I recently found myself in a situation, and he's telling a story. The Rebbe says, don't use that expression. Say, I placed myself in a situation. Because if you place yourself in one situation, you can then place yourself in another situation. If you're always thinking in passive terms, then you don't really take control of what you're going to do. I remember an adolescent young woman that I knew who was always getting into trouble and was always blaming it on other people. You know, they did this, I was influenced by this. And I said to her at one point, you know, you're the unluckiest person I know. You always fall in love with a bad crowd, and I'm very pessimistic about your future. I said, ironically, if you would sometimes take responsibility for the wrong things you did, I'd actually be optimistic about you, because if you can cause the problem, you can uncause the problem. And that's exactly what the Rebbe wanted people to do, to take responsibility. Don't say, I found myself in a situation, but say you placed yourself in a situation, and now you have the capacity to place yourself in another situation. Another aspect of the Rebbe, an enormous attention to the usage of language and to the usage of words. Early on in my writing of the book, I found out that the Rebbe had coined his own term for the Hebrew word for hospital. Just to get a sense of how many of you might know some Hebrew, call out the answer. What is the way, how do you say hospital in Hebrew? Beit Cholim. Beit Cholim is the Hebrew word that's generally used. I thought I had a shot at it. There seem to be a lot of doctors here, but okay. But in any case, so the term is, of course, Beit Cholim. If you know Hebrew, Beit Cholim literally means the house of the sick. And the Rebbe didn't like that term. He wanted hospitals to be called Beit Refuah, as somebody called, a house of healing. And he would write letters to hospitals in Israel urging them to change their name to Beit Refuah. And he said it's not just for reasons it's a euphemism, that it sounds nicer. He said it's actually accurate. Don't you want to see yourselves as houses of healing? When I learned that, it reminded me of something that my mother had told me, has to be 45 or more years ago. My mother was born in the Lower East Side, my mother, Alaa Shalom, was born in the Lower East Side in 1912. And she grew up in Manhattan and then in Brooklyn. And she said when she was growing up, there were hospitals in New York known as Home for the Incurables. There were Jewish homes for the incurables. There were Catholic homes for the incurables. There was a very famous cantor named Yossele Rosenblatt. I was once reading a bio of Yossele Rosenblatt, and I saw that he had performed at the Montefiore Home for the Incurables. And the president, Jacob Schiff, who was probably the most renowned Jewish philanthropist in the early part of the century, wrote him a thank you. He said, "Thank you for the great cheer that you brought to the inmates of the Home for the Incurables." And I thought, Genug, enough already. They're in the Home for the Incurables and you're calling them inmates? So the Rebbe was very into the usage of more positive language. And very often we feed ourselves with negative language. Very often parents feed their children, who they love, with negative language. They undermine them. And you need to have a more positive sense. 1976, 3 years after the Yom Kippur War, a group of severely wounded soldiers from Israel are sent by the IDF, by the Israeli army, to come to the United States. It's both to consult with the physicians here and also to bring some greater cheer into the lives of men who really have been very badly wounded. In Israel, such soldiers are known as Nechei Tzahal, the handicapped of Tzahal. One of the places they go to have a meeting with is with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe says to them, and the Rebbe almost always only delivered public speeches in Yiddish. This was one of the rare occasions he gave a speech to them in Hebrew, and he wanted them to be able to understand them without a translator, and obviously most younger Israelis don't know Yiddish. And he apologized to them because he had a very strong Ashkenazic accent, which is different than the way most Israelis pronounce Hebrew. You can understand what the person's saying, but it requires concentration. But he made a point to them. He says, you know, as a general rule, when people lose a limb or they lose some function, they develop compensatory mechanisms for dealing with it. Like, it's a known fact that people who are blind, God forbid we should all be spared that, people who are blind often develop more acute hearing. It's not only that they'll necessarily hear better than other people, but they will be able to deduce things from what they're hearing that the average person wouldn't deduce. So he said, so all of you have suffered some real loss, but you all have some compensatory mechanisms. In that regard, you're extraordinary. So why are you only defined by your limitation as Nechei Tzahal? Why are you not also defined as Mitzuyanei Tzahal, the excellent ones of Tzahal? And it reminded me of a memoir I had once read of a World War II veteran who had lost both arms and was put into a physical rehabilitation army hospital. And the day before they were released, a doctor practicing, he and others were released, a doctor practicing a form of what they call tough love said, this year you're all Army heroes. Next year you're all handicapped veterans. After that you're just a bunch of cripples. That's how the world will see you. That's how he sent them out into the world, the sense of realism. The Rebbe sent them out with the sense of extraordinary ones. Focus also on what you do have. And they said what was remarkable about it was many of these veterans said it was so good for them to be with somebody who wasn't just looking at them with pity. They couldn't stand it anymore. It became painful for them when friends would visit them because they were just being regarded with pity. And he was focusing on another aspect. The Rebbe tried to shy away from the usage of negative language altogether, to an extent that you don't even find in Talmudic sources. I think it was a bit innovative, and in a way he ended up anticipating, I think, the whole field of positive psychology. You know, we now know how important it is that children be imbued with a sense of their strengths. Very often, you know, it's occurred to me, it's not a great aspect of American life, the focus on people's weaknesses. You know, parents go to parent-teacher night at the school They meet with 5 teachers, they get 4 good reports and 1 bad report, and suddenly, what's the most important subject? Whatever with the bad report within. Which is stupid, because as a general rule, whatever the bad report was in, as long as the kid can at least pass, is probably not going to be crucial to his later life. I knew by the time I was a teenager that if I devoted 8 hours a day for the rest of my life to studying chemistry, the world of chemistry would not profit thereby. You know, we know, more or less. So I had to pass, I had to get through. But, you know, you can demoralize people when you always focus on their weakness. And the Rebbe really encouraged the strength because, guess what? Those strengths, as Yerucham Levovich, who was a Musar teacher, once put it, he said it's important for everybody to know what their weaknesses are. You have to know what to guard against. But he said, but it's even more important to know your strengths because ultimately it's those strengths that are going to enable you to overcome your weaknesses. So the Rebbe wanted to focus on the usage of positive language.